Hi, folks. Rob Goller here. Thanks for joining me for our weekly chat about local history. And thanks again for supporting this project, this video project, and all the research I do. It's great to get feedback. This week's topic comes from some conversations I've had, which often happens, is how I get topics, is journaling. Now, I sound like a broken record when I talk about this topic. You've probably heard me talk about it before, of the importance of journaling diaries to the recording of history, local history, national history, how much researchers rely on diaries of people, journals of people to understand everyday life. Newspapers are great. Official documents at your town and city halls are wonderful, but there's nothing that can replace the grassroots history of everyday people, even the famous people. Everything's not included. Their thoughts, their day-to-day operations, how things are happening day to day, what goes into what they're doing. So diaries are a gold mine of information for researchers. But for we often think of history as the past, but we have to think of history also in the sense of today's history being valuable to researchers in the future. So we are, it sounds like an old cliche, but we are living history right now. And so if we need to be thinking about the future and how they're going to understand how we live today. And the reason I'm bringing this topic up again, but in a different way, a slightly different angle about this topic, is it was brought up recently to me. Someone had said, "Oh, They were really excited about buying a journal, and they were starting the journaling." As I had and other historians, I'm certainly not the only historian who suggests journaling, but they had heard me talk about it and they bought a journal. But the problem was is they were stuck. They bought the journal. It was sort of like buying a membership to the gym, but not going to the gym yet. They got the journal, um, but they didn't know what to write about. They got writer's block because when you sit down, you're trying to figure out, and I get it. It took me a while to figure out what to write about and to basically feel free enough to write down my day, to talk about my day. Um, they just thought, this particular person thought that their life wasn't important enough and the things that were happening during their day were not important enough to include in a journal. They were trying to think these big things that happened during the day. They were repeating national news. But about the mundane things they thought during their day were too mundane to include in a journal. Who's going to care about it? They thought. Well, people will care about it, and actually, the mundane things are just as important as the big newsworthy events. I keep a journal. I've talked about this before. I keep a journal, and I have since probably high school, maybe even earlier, with some breaks in there. Uh, and I make a point every single day as part of my routine to write in the journal. Uh, part of uh, Part of the reason is selfish. It's actually quite therapeutic, so I highly recommend it. When you feel like you haven't accomplished anything during the day, when you actually force yourself to sit down and list what you did for the day, you'll discover that you actually do accomplish quite a bit. And so you give yourself a little more credit when you write about your day. But also, uh, I do it every day because I feel that I'm paying it forward for people who've kept diaries in the past. So I had what really started me on it is I think my second great grandfather kept a journal every day for 5 years, and it was one of those journals. They've had these journals published back in the 1800s, early 1900s, where you could January 1st every single day would have you'd have a slot for each day of January 1st for 5 years and so on. And that's the journal he kept. And I was inspired by that. But also at the historian's office and in many archives, you'll find journals. And we have several people who kept journals here in East Aurora, and it was about their life. And recently, so the reason this topic came up again was that some of our interns are actually going through some of the old journals that we have, and they've gotten a little distracted. We're actually trying to catalog them better. And one of our interns was particularly distracted in a good way by a journal of a man here in East Aurora who kept for a journal for a very long time, and there was this really heartbreaking story of his romance, or he actually wanted to pursue a young woman, and she was not giving him the time of day, and the story goes on and on and on. Um, so we were following that story, but also included were his day-to-day activities, taking the wagon somewhere, daily chores, church, things like that. So the point is that when it comes to what can you write about, anything you want is the answer. There's nothing too mundane. And some people feel like that they're being very personal, and yes, you sometimes are, but it doesn't always have to be. It could just be an itinerary of what you've done during the day. And it may seem mundane, and how no one's going to care. But for instance, last week I talked about the chicken barbecue, the Kiwanis chicken barbecue, and my experience with the chicken barbecue, and going over and getting our chicken, and we enjoy it on our front porch, and seeing all the people walk by. I wrote about that. So in 50, 100 years, if someone cares enough to read my journal, they'll see my perspective of that community event. Yes, there are photographs in the newspaper, but there's also my perspective. One of the things that I was thinking about yesterday, of an example of mundane things that end up in my journal in particular. For instance, yesterday I went through, and I've been slacking on this and procrastinating, but on a regular basis, and at one point I was doing it weekly, but I was trying to purge all the junk mail from my email. And so I would go through once a week and then unsubscribe. They tell you if you don't want people bothering you, you got to keep on it and unsubscribe from all these solicitations that you get through email. And so last night I sat down, and I had procrastinated quite a bit, so it took me quite a while to go through all of those emails and purge them. Now, a very mundane, very boring activity, and I almost forgot to include it in my journal that I wrote last night. And I thought, well, no, in 50, 100 years, what will those people think about us purging email? Will they still be using email the way we are? It's like 50 years ago, 40 years ago, even 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, where when you said junk mail, you meant actual mail that came by the U.S. Postal Service to the box in front of your house, not electronically through email. And so it means something different. So I wrote about it, and I'm thinking people will see the progress of junk mail through a mundane thing that I wrote about in my journal. I also talk about the presidential election coming up and my thoughts on that, family things that are happening, but everyday life, and being to remind people in the future what life was like today. And I actually wrote last night, because I was thinking about it, and I don't rarely do that, but I thought about the people who might be reading it in the future, and I actually wrote, I wonder what people, the person you, the reader, are thinking about this now, depending on what time period you're reading it, 50 or 100 years. Because we'll look back on some journals, and we'll have to be reminded that the folks didn't have television, didn't have internet, and if you're reading like one journal we have throughout the 1800s, I talk about him often, Mr. Bragg, who wrote a journal almost his entire life in the 1800s, is every day he wrote about everything he was doing in his life, and through that we realized, wait, they didn't even have radio, and how they got their news. So sometimes if there's a big event, I will look in his journal to see what he said on that day. And in some cases he did mention it, and sometimes the mention of this big world or national event is days later, because he didn't get the news until days later. Because the news was before the 1920s, the news took much longer time to get to people because there wasn't radio. It wasn't a journal, but the last week, on the anniversary of D-Day, I posted on the social media of the historians' pages of the reaction of East Aurora to D-Day, and the churches open for prayer, all those things. But one of the things that struck me is they said if people weren't listening to a radio in the morning, they would not have heard the news about the invasion, the D-Day invasion that morning. So the news took longer to get to people, and journals can give you a sense of that when people heard the news. And not everybody had a radio in their pocket like we do today. People are on their phones all the time and they get news right away. But you could have gone through half a day without hearing the news of the D-Day invasion if you weren't sitting at home, sitting at your radio. And a lot of people may not have been sitting at home next to a radio in the middle of the day. Maybe they'd sit down for a program or the news in the evening, but it wasn't like it is today. So we learn that perspective a lot of times through journaling. So write about whatever you want. Nothing is too mundane, and nothing is too big to include. It doesn't have to be just the big things. So you don't have to just do big events, and you don't have to do just small events. I attended a wedding, and I put that information in there. One of the interesting things about journals from the past, especially, is that before vital statistics records, a lot of these journals fill in the blanks, or when there wasn't a newspaper in the vicinity of where these people lived, they were the record holders of who was getting married, who died, who was born. They would actually journal about it. And so I do that today even, and talk about weddings I've attended, or people who've passed away, or people who've gotten married around and about me, even if I don't go to the wedding. What I did notice, we were just talking about this at the office a couple weeks ago, is the newspapers used to have pages of wedding announcements, and we don't have those anymore. We don't have pictures of the couple or the bride in the paper, or engagement announcements. It's just not as prevalent as it used to be. So it may be even more important today to be journaling these sorts of things. Some of the social news does not get included in the local newspaper, and perhaps the social things that you are doing, your journal might be the only thing that records it for future generations. So keep that in mind too. That could be a really important thing. It may seem silly to be recording that you went to a wedding, but you might be what tells people 50 years from now about that couple, and when they got married, and who attended their wedding, and all of that. Things that used to be included in the newspaper. Used to be very detailed descriptions of weddings, down to what the bridesmaids wore and what the bride wore, what the mother of the bride and groom wore. We just don't have that anymore. Now, you don't have to go into that much detail, but you get my point. You get my point that our journals, maybe they may seem outdated given all the technology we have, but actually it's the opposite effect. Because of all the technology we have, a lot of things aren't being recorded like they used to. So keep those journals. It's not hard. It's not supposed to be a hard thing. And if you're not comfortable putting something in, that's fine too. But I always like to think about that, yes, your grandkids and your great-grandkids are going to care about what you're thinking. Imagine what, if your grandfather or great-grandfather kept a journal, and you could go back and see what they were thinking, see what they were doing, the struggles they lived through, and that's one thing that I had struggled to put in my journal for some time, was the bad things that were happening, and now I do, and I put them in a safe place, keep them private. There's some things I don't want people to know, maybe today, of my thoughts about certain things, certain political things, perhaps. Or my interactions with people. But in the future, people will understand. And one of the things that I get out of reading about the past, particularly personal history, like journals, is that as much as we've changed over the years, technology has changed, our methods of communications have changed, human nature hasn't changed a whole lot. And so reading the struggles that my family went through puts in perspective of what my life is like, and how I don't often have the right to complain when you compare it to people who lived before me, before us. For instance, having to purge all the emails, the junk emails, yeah, that's a pain in the neck. It's not fun. But when I look back at, you know, people living 50 years ago, 100 years ago, they didn't have email. So they didn't, and so there's pros and cons to both. We have instantaneous communication today, but with that comes junk email. And so that gives a perspective, that little tidbit of information in the future when people are studying the past and trying to learn from 2024, the year we're living in. If someone's coming back trying to learn about our time here, they might think their perspective of email might be, wow, that was, people could communicate quickly, they could get in touch with someone very quickly. They probably will wonder why, the year 2024 things were so slow. Who knows what life's going to be like in 50 years? But with that too, something we don't always talk about is the junk mail. So that's another perspective that someone could learn by reading my journal entry just from yesterday. And that's just one example. It really is easy to keep a journal, and my suggestion is stop thinking about it so much. You're not, don't edit yourself too much. Just write about what you're thinking and let it flow. Don't worry about typos. Don't worry about grammar. Sometimes just let it out because sometimes we're our worst enemy when it comes to journaling. And everything is important. And what is really important too is sometimes what is not included. So sometimes I'll look back in someone's journal on a day, like say D-Day or Pearl Harbor Day. I want to see what people were thinking in their journal, and they don't write about it at all. Those events probably they did. Most people would have, but bigger events, and you'll go into a journal and you won't see anything. Well, that gives you perspective into that wasn't important enough to them to include, and what they decided to include rather than not. And so if the biggest event, and we see these in the 1800s journals all the time, was where the biggest event of the day was cutting trees down or taking a trip. Mr. Bragg, for instance, his journal, he lived in South Wales, and he actually one day talked about traveling to Crockershire, which is Westfalls today. And that was the event for the day. So today, if I drive up to Westfalls, it's maybe, 10 minutes there, 10 minutes back, maybe 15 minutes. But for them, it would have been the entire day. So that gives you perspective in life just of that time period just from that one journal entry. So, and he didn't think, anything of it. He wasn't like, well, this seems too mundane. My trip to Crockershire seems too mundane. Or me chopping wood today in the middle of winter seems too mundane. I won't include it in my journal. Well, we learn a lot from that. We learned that was a big deal, and they didn't get to travel much in the winter because they were stuck at home because roads weren't plowed. And they didn't have automobiles, so they didn't get to. They were pretty much shut in. Many people in the more rural areas during the winter times. So we learn that from the mundane stuff in the journals. So put it all in. Put in the big stuff that happens in your life: weddings, funerals, births, and also your mundane everyday activities. And nothing is too mundane to include in your journal. So that's probably the biggest advice I could give, and the advice I gave this person that was bringing it up to me is nothing is too small, nothing is too mundane, nothing is too insignificant to include in your journal. If it's on your mind as you're writing, write it in. And it's really what is on your mind. You're giving a perspective of what's on your mind for the day, and it's what's top of your mind, and it might not be the same thing that is for somebody else. But if it's on your mind, include it in the journal. And of course, you can include what you want and don't want to if you want to keep some things personal. But that's what's happening around you. Things happening in the community. I'll put that in there because the newspaper doesn't always cover everything. And my thoughts on something, the new bank at the plaza, new developments, houses being put up somewhere, or they're paving roads, just events around the town. Music Fest last week happened, and just a personal perspective and where I was and what I was doing during these things add flavor and give future researchers an eye as to what was happening in our community. So please journal. You don't have to do it every single day, but it's a great habit to start. And most importantly, as I said before, even though it's beneficial to future people to have a perspective of how we're living today, it's really, I've really found it very therapeutic and helpful to how I live my life today. Um, because it gives me, it allows me to appreciate things that I've accomplished. We're often too hard on ourselves, and we don't think we've done anything. We go through a day and we're like, oh, we didn't get anything accomplished today. But when you're actually forcing yourself to write it in a journal and communicate with someone in the future about your day, um, you find out you've actually accomplished more than you give yourself credit for. So if you have not started journaling, I highly recommend it. And when you do start journaling, just go for it. Don't overthink. Don't think about, should I include this? Shouldn't I? Everything is important when it comes to journaling. You're basically sharing your day with a future generation for someone who's going to read it. One last thing, someone always asks me about journals and what to do with them. I have a whole, mine are all on a shelf. Um, I'm planning to at some point donate them to the town archives, the historian's office, so they can be beneficial to future generations. But come up with a plan for them. Make sure you have them labeled, um, or someone knows that you trust where they are. Otherwise, they're in a box and they get thrown out. We did have one recent donation to the town archives of an entire box of someone's journals for years that could have easily been thrown out. And they weren't. They were saved, and we had thought maybe they were too personal, but we looked through, and they were just fine. Those sorts of everyday activities. Those could have been lost if they weren't properly labeled and labeled in a box and entrusted to a family member who made sure that they were kept with instructions. If you want them to be put in a public archive, or you don't, let them know. It's completely up to you. All right, thank you for joining me. As always, I appreciate the feedback and the support of this project, and keep the comments coming. Have a great week. We'll see you next time, and thank you for keeping history alive.